Hello, Lobbert here. Please consider giving this video a like and subscribe for more Pauper Commander content. If you'd like to support what I'm doing here, I'd love it if you became a patron. There's a link in the description to skip the player and commander introductions. Going first is Chris with One More Game MTG, a Magic YouTuber that also makes Pauper Commander content, as well as content for other Magic formats. He's also a fellow partner with the Common Connoisseurs. Going second is me, your host, Lobbert. Going third is Alcadron, a Pauper Commander Rules Committee member and one of the hosts of the PDHpod podcast. And going fourth is Wales. Chris is playing Garna, Bloodfist of Keld, a legendary 4/3 human berserker for 1 black-red-red. With, whenever another creature you control dies, draw a card if it was attacking. Otherwise, Garna, Bloodfist of Keld deals 1 damage to each opponent. Lobbert is playing Thraben Watcher, a 2/2 angel for 2 white-white, with flying, vigilance, and other non-token creatures you control get +1/+1 and have vigilance. Alcadron is playing Gorex, the Tomb Shell, a legendary 4/4 zombie turtle for 6 black-black, with, as an additional cost to cast this spell, you may exile any number of creature cards from your graveyard. This spell costs 2 less to activate for each card exiled this way. It also has Death Touch, and whenever Gorex, the Tomb Shell attacks or dies, choose a card at random exiled with Gorex and put that card into its owner's hand. Wales is playing Malcolm, Keen-Eyed Navigator, a legendary 2/2 Siren Pirate for 2 and a blue with flying, and whenever one or more pirates you control deal damage to your opponents, you create a treasure token for each opponent dealt damage. And partner with the partner of Rograk, Son of Roga, a legendary 0/1 kobold for 0 with First Strike, Menace, Trample, and Partner. Chris and Wales take a mulligan to 6, and the game begins. Chris draws for turn, plays Tramway Station as his land, and passes. Lobbert draws, plays a Snow-Covered Plains, and Thraben Inspector, which creates a clue. Lobbert passes. Alcadron draws a card, plays Barrenmoor as his land, and passes. Wales draws, plays his commander, Rograk, Son of Roga, an island, and Springleaf Drum. He passes. Chris draws, plays a swamp, and Fellwar Stone. Chris passes. Lobbert draws for turn, plays a Snow-Covered Plains, Soul's Attendant, and Steadfast Unicorn. Soul's Attendant triggers, so Lobbert gains 1 life. He attacks Wales with Thraben Inspector. Wales declares no blocks, so he takes 1. Lobbert passes. Alcadron draws, plays a swamp, and cycles Sojourner's Companion to put Vault of Whispers into his hand. He passes. Wales draws a card, plays Great Furnace as his land, and Kessig Flamebreather. Wales passes. Chris draws, plays a mountain, exiles Simeon Spirit Guide to add a red, and plays Emrakul's Hatcher, which creates 3/0/1 Eldrazi spawn tokens. Lobbert's Soul Attendant triggers. Chris passes. Lobbert draws a card, plays Study Hall as his land for turn, and Heliod's Pilgrim, which puts Benevolent Blessing into his hand and triggers Soul's Attendant. Lobbert then attacks Alcadron with Thraben Inspector, Soul's Attendant, and Steadfast Unicorn. Alcadron has no blocks, so he takes 3 damage. Lobbert passes. Alcadron draws for turn, plays Vault of Whispers as his land, and Bronze Walrus, which triggers Soul's Attendant and lets Alcadron scry 1 card to the top and 1 card to the bottom. He passes. Wales draws, plays an island, and Moonsnare Prototype, which he uses with Rograk to play his other commander, Malcolm, Keen-Eyed Navigator. Soul's Attendant triggers, and Wales passes. Chris draws a card and plays Phyrexian Vivisector, triggering Soul's Attendant. He then enchants Emrakul's Hatcher with Dark Privilege, plays Witch's Cottage as his land, and attacks Lobbert with Emrakul's Hatcher. Lobbert declares no blocks, so he takes 4. Chris passes. Lobbert draws and plays Airlift Chaplain, so he mills the top 3 cards of his deck and puts the Snow-Covered Plains into his hand, which he plays. He then passes. Alcadron draws a card, plays a swamp, and Crow of Dark Tidings, so he mills 2. He then exiles Gempalm Polluter, Gangrene Zombies, and Sojourner's Companion to play his commander, Gorex the Tomb Shell. Alcadron passes. Wales draws for turn, plays a mountain, and attacks Lobbert with Malcolm. Lobbert doesn't block, so he takes 2. Malcolm makes a treasure, and Wales passes. Chris draws and pays 4 mana, including 1 from an Eldrazi spawn, so Phyrexian Vivisector lets him scry a card to the bottom. He uses the mana to play his commander, Garna, Bloodfist of Keld. Soul's Attendant triggers. He then sacrifices another Eldrazi spawn for mana, so Phyrexian Vivisector lets him scry another card to the bottom. Garna triggers from the Eldrazi spawn dying 2, so each of Chris's opponents take 1 damage. Chris then plays Thatcher Revolt to make 3/1/1 human creature tokens with haste. He then attacks Wales with Emrakul's Hatcher, and Lobbert with 3/1/1 human tokens. Wales chump blocks Emrakul's Hatcher with Rograk, and Lobbert blocks the 3 human tokens with his 3/1/2s. Chris sacrifices the 3 humans to Dark Privilege. Garna triggers 3 times, so Chris draws 3 cards. Wheels then uses Springleaf Drum and Roguewreck to cast Impulse to look at the top 4 cards of his deck, put 1 into his hand, and the rest on the bottom. Chris passes. Lobbert draws a card and goes to combat. He attacks Wheels with 3 1/2s and a 1/1 with flying. Wheels blocks Thraben Inspector with Kessig Flamebreather and takes 3 damage. After combat, Lobbert plays Rock's Veteran, triggers Soul's Attendant, and passes. Alcadron draws and cycles Twisted Abomination to put his swamp into his hand. He then plays the swamp and attacks Wheels with Gorex, which triggers off of the attack, so Sojourner's Companion is put into Alcadron's hand. Wheels doesn't block, so he takes 4 damage. After combat, Alcadron plays Pitiless Vizier and passes. Wheels draws a card and plays Perilous Research, so he draws 2 cards and sacrifices a treasure token. He then attacks Lobbert with Malcolm. Lobbert is unable to block, so he takes 2 damage. Malcolm triggers, so Wales gets a treasure. After combat, Wales replays his other commander, Roguewreck, and passes. Chris draws for turn and plays Dragon Fodder, so he gets 2 1/1 Goblin tokens. Soul's Attendant gains Lobbert 2 life. Chris then plays Phyrexian Rager, so he draws a card and loses 1 life. Soul's Attendant triggers again. Next, Chris plays a Swamp and Wedding Invitation, which draws him a card. He then attacks Lobbert with Emerald's Hatcher. Lobbert doesn't block, so he takes 4 damage. Chris passes. Lobbert draws and plays his commander, Thraben Watcher. Soul's Attendant triggers. Lobbert goes to combat and Wales targets Thraben Watcher with Lightning Bolt, which destroys it. Lobbert continues to declaring his attacks and sends everything at Wales. Rock's Veteran's Battlecry triggers, so all of his other creatures get +1/+0 this turn. Wales doesn't block, so he takes 12 damage. Lobbert passes. Alcadron draws a card and attacks Lobbert with Gorex and Pitiless Vizier. Gorex triggers, so Alcadron puts Gangrenous Zombies into his hand. Lobbert is unable to block, so he takes 8 damage. After combat, Alcadron sacrifices Gorex to play Village Rites, so Gorex triggers. Gempalm Polluter is put into his hand, and then Village Rites resolves, so he draws 2. Next, he cycles Sojourner's Companion to put Darksteel Citadel into his hand, which he plays as his land for turn. He then plays Network Terminal and Gangrenous Zombies. Soul's Attendant triggers, and Alcadron passes. In his end step, Wales plays Anticipate, which triggers Kessig Flamebreather, so each of Wales' opponents take 1 damage. Anticipate resolves, so Wales looks at the top 3 cards of his deck, puts 1 into his hand, and bottoms the others. Wales draws for turn and plays Peek targeting Chris, so Kessig Flamebreather triggers. Wales looks at Chris's hand and draws a card. He then discards Simeon's Spirit Guide to play Thrill of Possibility, so Kessig Flamebreather triggers and he draws 2 cards. Next, he attacks Lobbert with Malcolm. Lobbert is unable to block, so he takes 2 damage. Malcolm triggers, so Wales gets treasure. Wales passes. Chris draws a card and plays Discordant Piper. Soul's Attendant triggers. Chris then plays Hordling Outburst to make 3 1/1 Goblin tokens. Soul's Attendant triggers 3 more times, and Chris passes. Lobbert draws for turn and attacks Chris with Airlift Chaplain, and Alcadron with the rest of his creatures. Rock's Veteran's Battlecry and other ability trigger, so Lobbert taps Alcadron's Crow of Dark Tidings. Chris cannot block, and Alcadron chooses not to block, so Chris takes 2 damage and Alcadron takes 10. After combat, Lobbert plays Obsidian Acolyte, gains 1 off of Soul's Attendant, and passes. Alcadron draws and cycles Gempalm Polluter to trigger Pitiless Vizier, draw a card, and deal 3 damage to Chris. He then activates Gangrenous Zombies to do 2 damage to each creature and each player. In response, Wales plays Desperate Ritual, which triggers Kessig Flamebreather, and uses the 3 red to play Thunderclap to deal 3 damage to Garna, Bloodfist of Keld, so Kessig Flamebreather triggers again. In response, Chris sacrifices his tokens, Phyrexian Rager, Discordant Piper, and the token that it generates to Dark Privilege to regenerate Emerald's Hatcher 9 times, trigger Phyrexian Vivisector, which allows him to scry 9 times, and triggers Garna 9 times, so Chris's opponents each take 9, which eliminates Wales, so his Thunderclap targeting Garna is removed from the game. Before Gangrenous Zombie's ability resolves, Lobbert activates Obsidian Acolyte to give Steadfast Unicorn and Soul's Attendant protection from black. Gangrenous Zombie's ability finally resolves, so each player takes 2 damage. Alcadron's Crow of Dark Tidings and Bronze Walrus, Chris's Phyrexian Vivisector, and Lobbert's Thraben Watcher, Heliod's Pilgrim, and Airlift Chaplain die. Garna triggers for 1 more damage when Phyrexian Vivisector dies, and Alcadron's Crow of Dark Tidings mills Alcadron for 2. He then plays Mire Triton, which gains him 2 life, and mills him for 2 more. He then attacks Chris with Pitiless Vizier. Chris chooses not to block, so he takes 4 damage. After combat, Alcadron exiles the 3 creatures with Cycling and Chain Devil out of his graveyard to cast his commander, Gorex the Tomb Shell. He enchants Gorex with Dragon's Shadow to give it +1/+0 in Fear, and then passes. Chris draws a card and transmutes Shred Memory to put Death Denied into his hand, which he casts, where X is 2 to put Discordant Piper and Phyrexian Vivisector into his hand. He then sacrifices Wedding Invitation to make Garna unblockable this turn. Next, he attacks Lobbert with Emrakul's Hatcher and Garna. Lobbert chooses not to block, so he takes 8. Chris passes. Lobbert draws and attacks Alcadron with Rock's Veteran and Obsidian Acolyte. He also attacks Chris with Soul's Attendant and Steadfast Unicorn. Rock's Veteran's Battlecry ability triggers. Before blockers, Lobbert activates Obsidian Acolyte to give Rock's Veteran protection from black. Chris and Alcadron are unable to block, so they each take 4 damage, so Alcadron is eliminated. After combat, Lobbert plays Kamiya False Hope, so he gains 1 life off of Soul's Attendant and passes. Chris draws, plays a Swamp, and Discordant Piper, which triggers Soul's Attendant. Chris sacrifices Discordant Piper to play Deadly Dispute to draw 2 cards and make a treasure. Garna triggers, so Lobbert loses 1 life. Discordant Piper makes a 0/1 goat token, which triggers Soul's Attendant. Chris then plays Phyrexian Vivisector, Nested Shambler, and Blood Pet, so Soul's Attendant triggers 3 more times. He then attacks Lobbert with Emrakul's Hatcher and Garna. Lobbert targets Garna with Swift Response to destroy it. In response, Chris sacrifices his goat to scry 1 off of Phyrexian Vivisector and trigger Garna to deal 1 damage to Lobbert. He then sacrifices Nested Shambler, triggers Phyrexian Vivisector, and Garna an additional time. Nested Shambler makes a 1/1 squirrel token, so Lobbert gains a life. Lobbert then takes 4 combat damage. Chris passes. Lobbert draws for turn and attacks Chris with everything. Rock's Veteran's Battlecry and other ability trigger, so Lobbert taps Phyrexian Vivisector. Chris blocks Rock's Veteran with Blood Pet and Kamiya False Hope with Squirrel token. Lobbert activates Steadfast Unicorn to give his creatures +1/+1 this turn, so Chris takes 9 damage and Lobbert passes. Chris draws and is able to play Garna again, but can't win through the Soul's Attendant and Kamiya False Hope, so he concedes. Thank you for watching until the end. Please consider giving this video a like and subscribe for more Pauper Commander content. If you'd like to support what I'm doing here, I'd love it if you became a patron. Check the playlists on this channel for more videos like this. Patreon shoutout to Achu, I've Cryptid, and Bill, Too Much Do. Thank you. When I need players for my Monday Pauper Commander streams, which is where this game was played, I use the Looking for Group channel in the Common Connoisseurs Discord to find additional players. It's free to join, so even if you don't plan on finding games there, I still recommend joining. It's just a great place to talk about competitive Pauper Commander.